seriously popular.
Hello and welcome to Apocalypse Now, dispatches from a world on the brink, the Daily Mail's weekly global news podcast. I'm David Patrikarakos, and I've spent the last 15 years covering foreign affairs and conflict in some of the world's most dangerous places. But even I have to ask, are we now staring into the abyss?
There's a lot of attention paid to fish because it's an emotive issue and it's about identity of communities. But on the other hand, it is worth bearing in mind that the fishing sector accounts for 0.04% of GDP.
Yes, there's a provisional deal, but it's opened the doors for more and more and more deals, which I worry will look a lot like rejoining the EU via stealth.
And inevitably, with any trade deal, there are trade-offs. Just to put it very simply, if I sell my car to you, I give up my car and you give up your money to me. And that is a deal that we both have decided is in our mutually considered interests. And neither of us would cry foul to say that somehow I should be allowed to keep my car and your money.
I sharply remember the outbreak of that invasion when the UK was quick to move forwards and say, we must arm Ukraine, we must do what we can, straight out of the blocks, we must apply sanctions. And the EU dithered, they wrung their hands. We were in a situation where Germany wouldn't even let us fly our own weapons over their airspace to get them there.
And so Brexit might have been a good idea, but at a bad time. And that may be its legacy.
This episode is brought to you by Loom by Atlassian. Are you feeling stuck at work? Get your team unstuck with Loom video messaging and move work forward. Use Loom to simultaneously record both your screen and yourself to share a quick update, provide feedback, train a colleague, and everything in between. Plus, add Loom AI to your meetings for instant written notes and recordings. Try Loom today at Loom.com. That's LOOM.com.
This episode is brought to you by GM Genuine Parts and AC Delco. Get the most out of your vehicle with GM Genuine Parts and AC Delco original equipment. The only parts designed, engineered, tested, and backed by General Motors. You can find your perfect fit for most makes and models and choose from 3 tiers of parts, including GM OE or gold and silver aftermarket parts. Visit gmparts.com for more information.
Sir Keir Starmer has heralded a new era in relations with Europe as he claimed his Brexit reset would boost the economy by £9 billion a year after he negotiated an end to checks on British food exports to the continent and linked British and European electricity markets together. He said the deal was, and I quote, a win-win. But Starmer is facing claims that he has surrendered to Brussels by accepting last-minute French demands on fishing that would give EU fleet access to UK waters until 2038. Kemi Badenoch, the Tory leader, described the agreement as a total sellout, while Nigel Farage, the leader of Reform UK, claimed it would result in the end of the British fishing industry. Harsh words indeed. It is, as they say, a game of two halves. Each deal comes with its own caveat. Case in point, British food exports to the EU will now be sped through borders. Brussels has agreed to lift the onerous veterinary checks that have caused long queues of lorries at ports since Brexit. Good news, but in return, Britain has promised to adopt immediate application of relevant EU rules with regards to food exports in a process known as dynamic alignment. A mysterious bureaucratic phrase that has immediately raised the hackles of some Brexiteers. And that's the problem. You can't please all of the people all of the time, which is politics in a nutshell, pretty much. And let's not forget the ongoing push and pull on everything from youth mobility, defence spending, energy and illegal migration, and appeasing those who voted to get Brexit done, a phrase that helped propel Boris Johnson to power. The shadow of Brexit, the great devourer of politicians, has already claimed the careers of 2 Tory leaders in David Cameron and Theresa May. Could it now be about to take its first Labour scalp? And let's not forget, we haven't even got onto those EU passport gates yet. Helping us unravel this political Gordian knot this week is Catherine Bernard, Professor of EU Law at the University of Cambridge and Senior Fellow at the UK in a Changing Europe, and broadcaster, journalist and former Brexit Party MEP for South East England, Alex Phillips. Catherine, good morning. So Catherine, Sir Keir Starmer has heralded this deal as a new era in relations with Europe, along with the promise of cheaper food and reduced bills. Is this deal really the glittering prize he's telling us?
It's not quite the glittering prize, but it's a step in the right direction for a government that has committed itself to a reset with the EU. The importance of this deal shouldn't be underestimated. The tone and the content is infinitely more positive than anything we've seen since we left the EU. Now, Rishi Sunak was able to reach an agreement with the EU over amendments to the Northern Ireland Protocol to try and smooth trade between GB and NI. But what's been agreed here is infinitely more ambitious, but still respecting the red lines that Keir Starmer has laid down, i.e. no single market, no customs union, and no return to free movement.
So in broad terms, what are we getting with this deal that we weren't actually getting before?
So, in fact, the deal comes essentially in three buckets. The first bucket is about defence and security, and that is the most concrete element of the deal. And having signed up to a defence and security pact, that paves the way for the EU to participate in the EU's €150 billion scheme for defence procurement. The second bucket is really an agreement to agree that Ursula von der Leyen described it as a roadmap for future negotiations. And that covers a wide range of issues. First and foremost, SPS. Now, SPS is sanitary and phytosanitary. It's about food. It's about animals. It's about plants going between the UK and the EU. At the moment, there is a considerable amount of paperwork which has to be completed, which adds significantly to the costs, and indeed has acted as a major deterrent to smaller businesses from trading with the EU altogether. Any deal there would help British exporters quite considerably, but it comes at a price, and the price is that we will have to follow EU rules. To use the jargon, it comes at the price of dynamic alignment. And it also envisages a residual role for the European Court of Justice. So that's one thing in the second bucket. Elsewhere, you also see agreement that we will negotiate signing up to ETS. It's a real potpourri of acronyms, but ETS is Mission Trading Scheme, to try to ensure that British exporters aren't subject to a tax when they export their goods called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And then thirdly, it's other matters, including a youth experience scheme, the new term for youth mobility scheme, which will allow a certain number of young people, we don't know how many or what age, but probably the under 30s, to come to the UK to work for a year, possibly 2 years. Now, again, the detail for all of that needs to be worked out. The roadmap is really a pretty high-level roadmap with all of the key detail missing. And then the third bucket is the sort of kicking the can down the road bucket. And that bucket has got a couple of things in it: improved relations over mutual recognition of qualifications, so to make it easier for UK professionals to practice in other member states. And secondly, something about touring artists.
From what you're saying, it doesn't seem like you give much credence to Nigel Farage's claims that this is the end of the British fishing industry.
No, that's not correct. Yes, Keir Starmer had to agree to a longer period than he wanted to for EU fishermen and women to fish in British waters. He wanted 4 or 5 years. He eventually agreed on 12. And this was done as a quid pro quo for 12 years with the SPS agreement. And that's to give certainty to both sides. Now, it does mean that EU fishermen and women will be able to fish in British waters, but pretty much at the level that they were at as agreed by Boris Johnson under the original deal, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Of course, fishermen and women won't be happy about that, but on the other hand, they will benefit from the SPS agreement because it means that they won't have to fill out the volume of paperwork that they have to fill out now to sell slightly less than fresh fish to the EU, and it's slightly less than fresh because it takes so long for the paperwork to be completed. And if the paperwork's rejected, therefore the fish are left not quite rotting, but certainly deteriorating in boxes at a port side. So there are swings and roundabouts. There's a lot of attention paid to fish because it's an emotive issue and it's about identity of communities. But on the other hand, it is worth bearing in mind that the fishing sector counts for 0.04% of GDP.
Let's talk about kicking the can down the road again. It's the Defence Pact. This is really important. This bucket. It allows UK defence companies to participate in the EU's 150 billion rearmament programme. But if our financial contribution has been put off for another day, if this particular can has been kicked down this road, what does this actually mean? Because right now, rearmament, in the wake of Ukraine and everything else, is an existentially important issue for Britain.
This is a problem right across the buckets, is what happens if the high-level agreement that we're going to agree on this doesn't actually come to pass? Because, of course, the devil, as always, is in the detail. And in some areas, there will be a requirement for financial contributions. It's what's called the pay-as-you-play model. And the trouble is we don't know, certainly it's not been published, how much that payment might be. On the other hand, I think there is a realisation on both sides, as you say, in respect of defence and security, this is existential. And I think what's striking about the deal, if you look at the joint statement that acts as a sort of umbrella over the other bits of the deal, there is a very strong commitment to working together to deal with the threat posed by Russia and the need to defend Ukraine. The language there is extremely strong. And I think both sides are absolutely realistic about how dangerous that threat is. And of course, although it's not explicitly stated, the pressure from the US that the EU's got to take much greater responsibility for its own defence.
Do you think in this age of heightened conflict and our comparatively strong position in terms of defence, that our leverage, our bargaining position is changing with the EU? And if so, are we exploiting this properly?
We're in a very different place to where we were at in 2016 when the Brexit vote occurred, and 2020 when we left, not least because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and not least, of course, because there's been a change in the occupancy of the White House. And so from that point of view, I think there's been a realisation that having the UK out in the cold with its defence capabilities, albeit somewhat reduced over the years, but with its defence capabilities, is not a wise and sensible thing for the EU to do. I think here it's better to talk about, rather than about the EU, to talk about Europe, because of course Norway too is playing an important role, and Norway's not an EU member state, although it is in the European Economic Area, the EEA. And this is a collection of liberal democracies in the West who recognise the need to step up in the face of really major challenges coming particularly from the eastern flank, coming from Russia. The other point to note is, of course, although we were originally bound to the EU via the treaties, which is no longer the case since Brexit, we are part of a European continent. Geography matters in international trade. We are 26 miles away from France, and the EU is by far our biggest trading partner. We are several hundreds of thousands of miles away from the US, and we trade much less with the US, certainly in respect of goods. So the idea that we would never be free, even pre the EU, of course, we were trading significantly with our European neighbours, and that's because that's where we're situated geographically.
If you were at the table, do you think there's more you could have got out of this deal? Could Starmer have done more?
So, given the nature of the red lines, there wasn't that much more he could have asked for, but there is one thing which is going to sound incredibly dull and techie, but is actually very important, and that's something called conformity assessment. Now, most people would doze off at this point because it's not very exciting, but practically it's very important. What conformity assessment means is that UK testing centres can test British products to say, yes, these conform to EU standards. There was no agreement whatsoever, either under Boris Johnson or here this week, about conformity assessment. And this is proving to be a real problem for UK manufacturers. So they have to get all of their stuff tested in EU member states, which again adds significantly to costs. And it's a great shame that that wasn't agreed, because there is recognition of conformity assessments with Canada, but not with the UK.
And Catherine, for those critics who claim that this deal is walking Brexit back, it's taking away a fairly won referendum, what do you say to them?
I would say that this deal does not take us back into the EU by no means. The core of the EU is the single market and the customs union, and this deal does not affect that. I would also say that it is an exercise of British sovereignty to decide with whom to trade and on what terms. Nobody talks about the fact that with the trade deal with India, for example, or with the CPTPP, that's the trade deal with the partners in Asia, that somehow we are surrendering sovereignty and reneging on commitments analogous to those created with Brexit. So what I would say is that all trading partners enter agreements of different sorts, and inevitably with any trade deal, there are trade-offs. Just to put it very simply, if I sell my car to you, I give up my car and you give up your money to me. And that is a deal that we both have decided is in our mutually considered interests. And neither of us would cry foul to say that somehow I should be allowed to keep my car and your money.
There are also some that say that even if this deal is okay in and of itself, it is the thin end of the wedge. It is the beginning of a process inexorably that will draw us back into the EU. Is there any credence to that?
Well, so long as Keir Starmer sticks to his red lines, the answer to that is categorically no. That said, it's quite clear we are getting closer than we were. But to be fair, it was a manifesto commitment of the Labour Party. And the very fact that Labour was elected with a quite significant majority tends to suggest that the British public wanted to be in that place. And certainly if you look at the polling, much depends on the question that's asked. But if you look at the polling, for example, about some sort of youth mobility agreement, the public support for that's pretty high. It's around 70%. So the public may be in a slightly different place, or the majority of the public may be in a slightly different place as compared to what some newspapers and some politicians might say.
And finally, Catherine, Brexit, Europe has been the great political devourer of our age. It did for Theresa May. It did for David Cameron. Will it do for Keir Starmer?
Now, that's putting me on the spot. I think he will weather this. Of course, much does depend on the detail of what's agreed in respect to that second bucket and how difficult the negotiations are over that. I think there is also a sense that the public are fed up with Brexit and they would just like it to be done and for us to be on better terms with our EU partners. I think one of the things that we have learnt was for those supporting Brexit, it would have been fine had the global situation not deteriorated so rapidly. Unfortunately, we were advocating free trade deals with partners across the globe and lots of international trade at a time when international trade is really under threat with a lot of onshoring, i.e. taking back trade. That's what you're seeing in the United States. You're also seeing it in China and elsewhere. And so Brexit might have been a good idea, but at a bad time. And that may be its legacy.
Catherine Bernard, thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Catherine Bernard, Professor of EU Law at Cambridge University. This is Apocalypse Now. We'll return after the break with Alex Phillips, former Brexit Party MEP for South East England. Stay with us.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
Welcome back to Apocalypse Now, dispatches from a world on the brink. We're still talking about Keir Starmer's so-called new era and the latest deal between the UK and Europe. Now we are joined by Alex Phillips, former Brexit Party MEP for South East England. Alex, welcome. As someone who presumably voted for Brexit, and certainly campaigned for it. Do you feel that Starmer is walking Brexit back? Is he running roughshod over a democratic vote?
Well, yes, he is. And look, I'm not going to be one of these Brexit zealots. Of course, I believe very passionately about it as a Brexit Party MEP. But I'm not going to be one of these zealots who says absolutely no relationship with the EU under any circumstances. There are areas in which we certainly should cooperate. And even though I think that Starmer's promise to smash the gangs is flimsy, the intention to actually work with Europe on things like information sharing and police cooperation is really good and positive. But, and here's the big but, there's always this sense that Sir Keir Starmer's more comfortable within globalist blocs and that he's never really made a pretense of wanting to rejoin the EU until he became Prime Minister and realised that wasn't politically expedient. And the negotiation he's had doesn't seem to me to be much of a negotiation at all. It doesn't even seem to be a deal, because a deal suggests that we will be getting positive things in return, or we would have had at least part of that, which reflects the British interests. And while I think some things do that, there are so many open spaces where this is essentially a first step of many. Yes, there's a provisional deal, but it's opened the doors for more and more and more deals, which I worry will look a lot like rejoining the EU via stealth.
But is there not an argument for saying that we're not rejoining the EU, but by cherry picking a deal here, a deal there, we're actually getting a lot of things on our terms without rejoining?
Well, I'm not sure what is on our terms with all of this, because it was Europe who came to us really because they need to enter a massive process of weapons procurement, and our weapons industry, our arms industry, is one of the world leading ones. So they said, would you like to join EU joint procurement? Yes, that'd be great. Okay, but you have to pay to do that. And then you also have to give us access to fishing waters, which has been a real big sticking point. And so Sir Keir Starmer said, okay, we'll do it for another 4-year term. They insisted on 5 years. Somehow, when the deal came to pass, it had become 12 years, which has a genuine risk of decimating the UK fishing industry, because in 12 years' time, a lot of fishermen will have retired, and you'd have to question how many new fishermen would be joining the industry when they're very limited as to what they can catch. You know, in some respects, perhaps the erosion of the barriers to trade is a good thing, but dynamic alignment, where we have to follow EU rules and be under the jurisdiction of the European Courts of Justice on this one matter, is a very perilous path to go down, because there'll be arguments about, well, okay, now that's in place for agriculture, what about financial services? We also need you to sign a treaty on this. We need you to sign a pact on that. And things like the carbon trading deal, okay, people might say there's a lot of positives in this, in terms of we can have a better relationship with our continental neighbours to share power and join up our grids even further to make sure there are no outages or surges. And that's very important in the modern era. But at the same time, by the back door, it ties us into their net zero targets, which I think is going to be one of the critical points in the forthcoming general election. And it has to be critical because the UK's got some of the highest energy prices in the world, but it does actually have a way in which it can start to reduce those prices, which will be, albeit potentially a transition period, if those people who are leading the country want to stick to commitments to net zero, the ability to get our own fossil fuels out of the ground, out of the oceans, use them, sell them, and use that as a platform through which to then invest into net zero agendas. I personally don't subscribe to the net zero agenda, but even politically, pragmatically, that seems to me a more sensible route to go down. So there are things in this deal. I mean, for instance, the Defence Pact as well. Okay, so we've actually ruled out certain elements, saying we don't want to be too tied into any EU joint cooperation. We need to have vetoes on that. But we know that there's another paper coming forward soon from Ursula von der Leyen, where she's probably going to go further than Barnier did in 2018 about tying the UK into what essentially amounts to joint foreign policy. So I feel like this deal has been rushed. I don't feel like enough exceptions and concessions were asked for or granted. And so I do worry for the future, because he's only been in power 1 year, and I think this is going to be the first step of many.
So this is interesting, because at the heart of all of this, whether it's fish or defence, is the nature of our relationship with Europe, with the EU. We are on this continent. We cannot escape it. It is a colossal trading bloc. Now, I'm someone that's spent the last 11 years covering Ukraine. You talk about Europeans' need for our defence industry. Do you think that this is the kind of political leverage that going forward Britain can use in a positive way? I don't mean use in a negative way, in order to get good deals out of the EU, because after all, this is, as I say, a bloc we cannot ignore.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I've always said that. It's important we have a great relationship. They should be our best friends and some of our closest partners on matters of, continental interests. But the thing is, where we do have leverage, where we should push back on the EU, is they absolutely not know we're going to call the shots. And if you want X, then we're going to demand Y. We haven't been doing that. And in terms of the defence cooperation, I know there's a lot of reservations from people within the defence sector about whether closer EU entanglements will be a good thing or a bad thing, whether that will undermine NATO when it comes to decision making. And also, you spoke about Ukraine. I sharply remember the outbreak of that invasion when the UK was quick to move forwards and say, we must arm Ukraine, we must do what we can, straight out of the blocks, we must apply sanctions. And the EU dithered, they wrung their hands. We were in a situation where Germany wouldn't even let us fly our own weapons over their airspace to get them there. Germany, again, didn't really want to put sanctions on Russia because of the close economic relationship, particularly bound up to Nord Stream 1 and the proposal of Nord Stream 2. And so when it comes to crises, what I have seen time and time again, whether it's during COVID and vaccine procurement, whether it's the Eurozone crisis, is the EU actually doesn't work very well at responding to crises. It either moves far too slowly or it has the approach of using a crisis to push forward its own imperial agenda, let's say. And it has a tendency at the wrong times to move fast and break things, as with the single currency, and at critical moments to not move when it's necessary. And so it's so important that Britain, as a sovereign nation and also an Atlanticist nation, our relationship with America, the special relationship, as it's often called, is vitally important and is proven important throughout history. And we know how the current occupants of the Oval Office feel about Europe and its approach to defence and foreign affairs. And you have to wonder whether this has the risk in future of undermining our relationship with America, particularly in the element of foreign affairs, because the EU is, at best, let's say, it's sceptical about America. At times, there are elements of the EU which to me seems very anti-America.
So sure, but this is interesting because I think what we've also seen from the United States is that it's perhaps not the reliable ally that it once was. Now, at this podcast, it's Name Apocalypse Now. We talk a lot about entering a new kind of world, a new era where it's more about hard power. It's more about might is right. The rules-based order that we've lived under for 80 years in the aftermath of World War II is ending. Now, again, I think that personally, within Europe, this means Britain will grow in importance. We may have underarmed for years, but we're still ahead of the Europeans. So with this leverage, what in the end, Alex, is the type of relationship that you see the UK having with Europe? This bloc that in the end that we cannot escape?
Yeah, well, I think it should be on a sort of more dynamic basis where when a situation arises, look, for better or for worse, we partnered with France independently when it came to Libya. I don't necessarily think what happened there had very good results. And for better or for worse, we partnered with America when it comes to interventions in the Middle East. And so I think it needs to be on a case-by-case basis, which at the moment is vaguely what the deal suggests, that there can be vetoes and exceptions, but that isn't the intention. That is not going to be the long-term plan. And that's certainly not what the EU wants to see happen. And you're right, we should actually have great leverage with the EU over this in terms of we do have a brilliant defence sector where we can help our European allies have arms to train them, to cooperate with them. But then we should be using that for our own advantage rather than going down the route we have done, which is paying them for them to have access to our defence market. And at the same time, handing over a lot of other things, such as access to our fishing waters and returning to the jurisdiction of the ECJ, albeit in one sector. Like I said, I think this will be a thin end of a wedge. So normally when countries trade, when countries do arms deals, it's usually in a unique basis where you say, we need to buy weaponry or we want to sell weaponry, and you forge a relationship in foreign policy built upon that. People always say, if you want to know where loyalties lie in geopolitics, follow the money. And so we should have been able to use this as a better advantage and be there to stand shoulder to shoulder with Europe. But Europe is the one who puts obstacles in the place and says, for instance, we are saying we need to cooperate when it comes to the small boats crisis, but they will not consider any sort of returns agreement. They will say there can't be sharing of certain digital intelligence because we're not in Schengen. And you just think, why are you being so obstructive constructive. You know, there are ways in which we should be cooperating as a continent. Blimey, that was a slip of the tongue. But instead of doing that, they're the ones who constantly use crises as forms of leverage to regain control over us. And that wasn't what Brexit was about.
Look, I agree with you when it comes to the bureaucratic behemoth that is the EU. But I'll ask you again, do you still think the United States is a reliable ally in the Trump era?
It's hard to say, is what I would say, because on some level, I think that America's approach to Europe, saying, go it alone, we're fed up of backing you up, has its positives, because I do think Europe needs a wake-up call, and I do think Europe has woefully underinvested into defense and actually responded to the Ukraine crisis woefully. So America saying, we're going to essentially cut the apron strings and you've got to stand on your own 2 feet is having a positive outcome, because it's making Europe suddenly go, okay, right, we're going to procure weapons, we're going to invest, we can't rely on America. If there was a big and genuine crisis in Europe, would America run to our rescue? Well, I don't know. I would hope it still does. It has its own political problems when it comes to Ukraine and is dealing with that situation in its own way, which again, I think has both positives and negatives involved. Are they a reliable ally? I think to Britain, yes, they always will be. I can't imagine that disappearing. But to other countries in Europe, I'm not sure this current administration is that interested. But then you have to ask yourself whether that reflects history as well. You know, you look at 2 world wars and American involvement there, and you realize that America has often left it to the 11th hour and been quite late to the table at coming to Europe's aid. So I think if push comes to shove, would the Western world pull together? Yes, I certainly think it would. Would it be nicer to feel sort of warm and comforting words from America right now? Perhaps for many European countries, yes. But at the same time, did they need a wake-up call? Indeed. And that the way that Trump seems to do things is to attack things with a hammer and go for the shock and awe tactic to force people into a position. And then down the line, it gets mollified. So I think the jury's out on this one.
Broadly speaking, let's look at business now. We're talking about fish, which is, of course, an economic issue in the end. There is a consensus now, I think, that Brexit has done more harm than good to the UK, at least in terms of business and trade. How would you say to that? So at least I guess we can say this fish deal is kind of getting things moving again. Any positives at all?
So I am not against the idea that if we want to sell things into the EU, we must obey their standards, because that is what all trading relationships say. If we wanted to import beef from Brazil, we would make sure that they followed a certain checklist. And that doesn't concern me. What does is the fact that it's a universal blanket application of EU regulation that they determine, impose upon us, and it comes under the jurisdiction of their courts. And it doesn't therefore apply to just the products we sell to them. It applies to everything and could scupper our chances of doing further trade deals around the world. Now, when people say Brexit hadn't been a success so far, I would argue a couple of points. First of all, we hadn't even really technically left the European Union until about 4 years ago. During those 4 years, we had a tumultuous period under the Conservative governments where the leader kept changing. There was no coherence, there was no strategy, and so nothing was really made of Brexit. And perhaps actually, and I'm not one to often praise Starmer, but perhaps actually he's been the first Prime Minister to grab hold of some of the Brexit dividends and say, right, we're going to do a trade deal with India. Well, it's not really a trade deal with America, it's a precursor. It's a softening of Trump's punitive measures against the world with his tariff policy. But there was a dialogue there, which does actually show that there is a sort of, I think, a softness to Britain, which Europe doesn't enjoy. And there was much scope going forwards to do more trade deals around the world. These things take a lot of time. They're not done overnight. Brexit was always going to be a long-term process. And it was essentially a tabula rasa upon which a government can write its own agenda. And in some respects, Starmer has done that. So he renationalised the steelworks up in Scunthorpe, which couldn't have been done probably if we were members of the EU. He started to make moves of renationalising railways, which wouldn't have been able to be done in the single market under the Railways Directive. So ironically, he's someone who has actually taken some of the sovereignty we won back and started to use it based on his own political agenda, which is what Brexit's all about, self-governance, and so we can hold our government to account. I just hope, and my big concern is that this is one initial pact which opens up the door for further and further pacts, more and more negotiations. We know how the EU plays hardball and doesn't ever give away concessions and demands a lot. Starmer at the first hurdle seems to have said, okay, fine, we'll just let it all be Europe's way. And I do worry going forward if that's going to scupper other advantages of Brexit, where we could have been creating far more exciting trade relationships around the world. After all, Europe, when we joined the EU, had about 30% of global GDP. That's now sunk in the past 20 years to under 20%, if not at times much lower. And it does seem to be a declinist bloc where there isn't innovation due to bureaucracy, due to red tape. We do need to trade with Europe. They're always going to be our greatest trading partners because of the geographical proximity. But we also have a unique position in the world where we've got relationships with the Commonwealth group of nations. And interestingly, when you look at those trade statistics that are currently being pushed out, talking about the decline in trade to Europe, it's quite convenient that what's been struck off that list, the trade figures pertaining to the processing and resale of tropical fruits in the Commonwealth that we imported, packaged and sold back into Europe. Now, because of the nature of our relationship with the EU now, those statistics are no longer considered when it comes to looking at agricultural exports. So there are certain things on the ledger that have been conveniently struck off to paint a darker picture than it really was.
Brexit did for David Cameron and Theresa May, and with a lot of help from himself, probably in a roundabout way, Boris Johnson. Can you see it undoing Keir Starmer?
Yeah, I absolutely can. And I'll tell you for why. It is very clear at the moment that the core issues for British voters are open borders and cost of living. The two things that any government needs to do if it's going to curry favour and retain support of the electorate is to show that it is properly managing in with migration and properly bringing down bills and the cost of living. Now he's about to sign up to potentially this was not allowed to be the youth mobility scheme anymore because it's got the word mobility in it. So it's called something like the Young People's Energy Scheme or something now. And it's unclear what that's going to look like. I have great reservations. I think that the EU essentially want to use this to start to redistribute some of those young men who are under the age of 30, who have come into the continent over the past 2 decades. We don't know the nature yet of the sort of inward migration we're going to have now if we sign this deal, and whether or not that will involve dependence, which the EU is pushing for. So I think that will be an issue that Starmer doesn't really grab the nettle with. And when it comes to the cost of living, at the heart of all of this is our energy bills. And in signing up to the carbon trading scheme, we are essentially compounding our net zero targets. We are preventing ourselves from being able to be fleet of foot and say, right, we're going to drill for oil or gas, or we're going to do exploratory fracking in order to see how we can better aid an energy transition or bring wealth back to the country and have more energy sovereignty. So given those to me are the two biggest issues right now for voters, I think there's a lot in this preliminary pact with the EU that is going to prevent Starmer from doing anything serious about them.
Alex Phillips, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you to both my guests, Catherine Bernard, Professor of EU Law at Cambridge University, and Alex Phillips, former Brexit Party MET for South East England. And thanks to you for listening. Join me, David Patrikarakos, next time as we continue to bring you dispatches from a world on the brink. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, TikTok and Instagram at Apocalypse Now Pod. And you can get in touch via email at apocalypsenowpod@dailymail.com. We'll see you next week as we once again ask, Apocalypse Now?